Picture this. It's August 15th, 1940. You're 15,000 feet above the English Channel, strapped into the most advanced fighter aircraft in the world. Below you, black smoke rises from burning oil tanks at Dunkirk. Around you, the sky is swarming with Messerschmitt 109s, yellow noses, black crosses, swastikas gleaming in the summer sun. A 109 rolls right in front of your gun sight. This is it, your moment. You slam the control stick forward to dive after him, and your engine dies. Complete silence. You're not flying anymore. You're falling. A 7,000-pound glider with a dead engine and a German fighter somewhere behind you, circling back for the kill. This wasn't pilot error. This wasn't bad luck. The Spitfire, the legendary aircraft that supposedly saved Britain, had a fatal design flaw that every Luftwaffe pilot was trained to exploit. A weakness so fundamental it came down to a single component, a carburetor. And for months, while Britain fought for survival, this flaw was killing pilots. Winston Churchill called it Britain's finest hour, but he didn't mention how close that hour came to being Britain's last. This is the story of how a simple mechanical problem nearly handed Hitler victory in the Battle of Britain. Let's start with what everyone knows about the Spitfire. By the summer of 1940, it was already a legend. Graceful, deadly, beautiful. The elliptical wing that looked like it was carved by an artist. The Merlin engine that roared like thunder. Pilots who flew it spoke about it like they were in love. It was the most beautiful aircraft I have ever flown in my life. You didn't fly a Spitfire, you just strapped it on. It was natural to you. And it performed like a dream. 362 miles per hour, 20,000 feet in 9.5 minutes. The turn radius was so tight, it could spin circles around German bombers. But here's what was actually happening in August 1940. Germany controlled France, Belgium, Holland, Denmark, Norway, Poland. The Luftwaffe had 2,700 operational aircraft stationed just across the English Channel, a 20-minute flight from London. Britain had 650 fighters. Total. Of those, only 230 were Spitfires. Winston Churchill knew the stakes. He'd told Parliament exactly what was coming. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. Hitler knows that he will have to break us on this island or lose the war. And on the other side of the channel, German pilots were confident. They'd swept through Poland in days, crushed France in weeks. The Luftwaffe hadn't lost yet. One German fighter pilot later recalled, "We believed we would win the war." This was the beginning, and now I was able to show what a talented and experienced pilot I was. So when these two forces finally met in the skies over southern England, something had to give. The Spitfire was Britain's champion. Fast, maneuverable, armed with 8 machine guns. The Messerschmitt 109 was Germany's apex predator. Fuel-injected engine, 20mm cannons, battle-tested over France. They were almost perfectly matched. Almost. May 1940. 3 months before the Battle of Britain officially begins, British forces are evacuating from Dunkirk. German armies have them pinned against the sea. Spitfire squadrons fly from England to protect the evacuation. And that's where they first encounter the Messerschmitt 109 in serious numbers. A British pilot describes what happened. "We flew about 70 to 80 miles across the sea to Dunkirk. You could see it miles away because of the enormous column of smoke from burning oil tanks. We were about 15,000 feet up, flying around, not seeing anything at all. Then without any warning, suddenly the sky was full of Messerschmitt 109s with yellow noses, swastikas, and big black crosses. The fights were vicious, turning, diving, climbing, Spitfires and 109s locked in a deadly dance. And British pilots started noticing something strange. Whenever a Spitfire got on a 109's tail, whenever a British pilot had the advantage and was about to take the shot, the German pilot would do something simple. He'd push his nose down and dive, and the Spitfire couldn't follow. A British pilot remembered the frustration. In the early days, you would push the stick forward to get away from it, but in a Spitfire, if you did that, the engine would cut out, so you found yourself in a difficult position. A German pilot explained their tactic. When he saw that he was losing in the turn and that eventually I would get on his tail. He simply put his nose down and went straight out. Something was wrong with the Spitfire, something fundamental, and as the Battle of Britain was about to begin in earnest, British pilots were about to discover just how deadly this problem really was. So what was actually happening inside that Merlin engine? Let's talk about the carburetor. It's not glamorous, but it's about to become the most important component in the entire aircraft. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, this magnificent 27-liter V12 1,000 horsepower masterpiece, used a float-type carburetor. Same basic principle as the one in your grandfather's car. Here's how it works. Fuel sits in a small chamber. A float rides on top of the fuel, controlling a valve that lets more fuel in when the level drops. Gravity feeds the fuel into the engine. Simple, reliable, proven technology. But there's a problem. When you push the stick forward and enter a dive, you create negative G-forces. Everything in the aircraft that isn't bolted down wants to float up toward the canopy, including the fuel in that carburetor. The fuel surges away from the intake. The float chamber empties, and suddenly your engine is sucking air instead of fuel. The Merlin starves, it coughs, it dies. You're at 15,000 feet with a dead engine and an enemy fighter somewhere behind you. Now look at the Messerschmitt 109. German engineers had equipped it with a Daimler-Benz DB601 engine with direct fuel injection. No float chamber, no gravity dependence, just a pump forcing fuel directly into the cylinders under pressure. Negative G's, positive G's, upside down? Didn't matter. The fuel kept flowing. The most advanced fighter aircraft in the British arsenal had been designed with the same fuel delivery system as a 1930s automobile, and the Germans knew it. By July 1940, Luftwaffe pilots were being specifically briefed on this weakness. The intelligence was clear. The Spitfire can outturn you. It's faster in a climb, but it cannot follow you in a dive. The standard German escape tactic became this simple. When a Spitfire gets on your tail, push the nose down and dive at full throttle. The Spitfire pilot has two choices: let you escape or push forward and watch his engine cut out. Either way, you survive. One Luftwaffe pilot described the tactic. When he saw that he was losing in the turn and that eventually I would get on his tail, he simply put his nose down and went straight out. It was humiliating for British pilots. Here they were, flying the supposedly superior aircraft, watching enemy fighters escape time and time again because of a mechanical limitation. A British squadron leader later wrote in frustration, "When a 109 went into a dive, it was very, very difficult to keep up with him. You found yourself in a difficult position, but frustration was the least of their problems, because in combat, when you lose your engine, you don't just lose your prey, you become the prey." August 1940, the Battle of Britain reaches its peak intensity. The Luftwaffe is flying up to 1,500 sorties a day. Their objective is simple: destroy the Royal Air Force, achieve air superiority, and clear the way for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. RAF Fighter Command is stretched to breaking point. Pilots are flying 4, 5, sometimes 6 sorties a day. There's barely time to eat between scrambles, and the losses are mounting. In August alone, the RAF loses 338 fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair. 133 of those are Spitfires. The mathematics are brutal. Britain is receiving about 245 new Spitfires per month from the factories. But if losses continue at this rate, the RAF will run out of aircraft and pilots within weeks. In Germany, Hitler is watching the numbers. His generals are confident. Air Marshal Hermann Göring boasts that the Luftwaffe will wipe out Fighter Command in 4 days. And in Britain, young men are dying because their perfect aircraft has an imperfect heart. One pilot later reflected on those desperate days. The fact of the matter is, I think those people like myself realized that within weeks we could have the Germans landing on this island of ours. We realized that there was no way we were going to win. I think, quite frankly, if you ask me bluntly, are we going to win this war? I think we'd be bloody lucky if we do. The Spitfire was supposed to save Britain, but how do you win when your greatest weapon has a fatal flaw? Here's the thing about combat. You either learn fast or you die. British pilots couldn't wait for engineers to fix the carburetor problem. They couldn't ground the Spitfire fleet for modifications. The Germans were coming every single day, and RAF Fighter Command needed every aircraft in the sky. So pilots started experimenting. One pilot remembered the moment of breakthrough. If I had simply pushed the nose of my Spitfire down to chase him, I would have lost my engine. So what I did instead was a sweeping left turn, taking the plane down at the same time. I did it in such a way that I came out just about 50 yards behind the 190, and that was quite successful. It was called the half roll and dive. Instead of pushing the stick forward, which creates negative G, you roll inverted first, then pull back on the stick. Pulling back creates positive G forces, which keep the fuel flowing into the carburetor. Then you're diving, engine still running, and you can chase your target. It sounds simple, but try imagining it. You're in a dogfight. A 109 dives away. You have maybe 2 seconds to react before he's out of range. You have to roll your aircraft upside down, pull back hard on the stick, track your target while inverted, then roll upright again to line up your guns, all while traveling at 400 miles per hour with enemy fighters all around you. One mistake and you're dead. But it worked, and word spread through the squadrons. Another pilot described the learning curve. It was learning on the job the whole time. If you survived that period, of course, your chances of getting through and coming out alive were somewhat better. They were literally inventing new aerial combat tactics in the middle of battle, not in training, not in peacetime exercises, in live combat, with real bullets against an enemy that outnumbered them 3-1. But the carburetor wasn't the only issue. British pilots discovered another problem when trying to chase 109s in a dive. The ailerons, the control surfaces on the wings that let you roll the aircraft, were covered in fabric. At high speeds, the fabric would distort under air pressure. The shape would change, and suddenly, you couldn't keep the aircraft steady. One pilot described the terrifying experience. At that time, the ailerons of the Spitfires were fabric covered, so you couldn't hold it steady in the dive. As you rocked up to higher speeds, the air pressure on the covering changed the shape. After I got to a certain speed, I started to lose control. The aircraft was turning away, and I couldn't keep it straight any longer. Imagine that. You've just mastered the half-roll technique to keep your engine running in a dive. You're finally able to chase that 109, and now your controls stop responding properly. The 109 has metal-covered ailerons, rock solid at any speed. The Spitfire's fabric ailerons start to fail at exactly the speeds you need them most. It's another advantage for the Germans. Another thing British pilots have to work around. The thing is, you're learning all this in combat. There's no instructor, no training manual, just trial and error. And error means death. Let me tell you what this looked like in actual combat. August 16th, 1940. A Spitfire pilot finds himself in a perfect attack position. A Messerschmitt 109 is right in front of him, unaware, vulnerable. He lines up his shot. His thumb hovers over the gun button, and then the 109 pilot sees him. The German does exactly what he's been trained to do. Nose down, full throttle, dive. The British pilot has maybe 1 second to make a choice, push forward and lose his engine, become a sitting duck, or roll inverted, pull back, execute the half-roll dive. A complex maneuver. While tracking a moving target, he chooses the roll, inverts the aircraft, pulls back hard. The G-forces crush him into his seat. Blood drains from his head. His vision starts to tunnel, but the engine keeps running. He's diving now, inverted, watching the 109 grow larger in his gun sight. He rolls upright, lines up the shot, and fires. 8.303 machine guns open up. Tracers arc across the sky. The 109 starts streaming smoke. He survives. The German doesn't. But here's the thing. If he'd hesitated even half a second longer on that roll, the 109 would have been out of range. If he'd pushed forward instead, his engine would have cut, and he'd have been the one shot down. That's what every single engagement looked like. Split-second decisions. Perfect execution required. No room for error. One pilot put it simply, nothing was going through your mind. You were just thinking about the drill. You had taught yourself how to avoid being shot down. You were looking behind yourself every 10 to 15 seconds to make sure no one was behind you. You just concentrated on that. Then when you did see someone, you went in like a bull in a china shop. By September 1940, something was changing. British pilots were getting better, the tactics were spreading, the half-roll dive was becoming second nature, and crucially, Spitfire production was ramping up. In July, the RAF received 80 new Spitfires. By August, that number hit 245. The factories were finally delivering, but more importantly, the Germans were making mistakes. Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, was receiving faulty intelligence. His officers were telling him that fighter command was on the verge of collapse, that just a few more days of pressure would break the RAF. One German pilot later admitted, the German leadership was not accurately informed. They were not in a position to judge the Royal Air Force correctly and issue us with appropriate orders. The Royal Air Force was much stronger than we had assumed. Hitler was getting impatient. The invasion barges were assembled on the French coast. The German army was ready, but the Luftwaffe couldn't deliver air superiority. On September 15th, the Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids against London. Over 1,500 aircraft. It was meant to be the knockout blow. Instead, the RAF met them in force. Spitfires and Hurricanes tore into the German formations. The Luftwaffe lost 56 aircraft that day. Fighter command lost 28. The math had shifted. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain was off, the Battle of Britain was over, and the Spitfire, flaws and all, had survived. Back in Britain, engineers had been working on the carburetor problem the entire time. They knew about it before the war started, but fixing it meant redesigning the fuel system, testing new components, and modifying every Spitfire already in service. There was no time for that when Britain was fighting for survival, so they came up with a temporary fix, a small metal disc with a hole in the center, a restrictor plate that limited fuel flow just enough to prevent the float chamber from emptying during negative G. It was crude. It reduced engine performance slightly, but it worked. Mechanics could install it in minutes, and suddenly, Spitfire pilots could push the stick forward and dive without their engines cutting out. The full solution, a proper negative G carburetor, would come later, in the Mark 9 Spitfire and beyond. But by then, the critical moment had passed. Britain had held on just long enough. Here's something that often gets forgotten. The Spitfire wasn't alone. The Hawker Hurricane accounted for more enemy aircraft destroyed during the Battle of Britain than the Spitfire did. It was slower, less glamorous, but it was sturdy, reliable, and easier to repair. One pilot summed it up perfectly. There's a split between those that favor the Hurricane and those that give credence to the Hurricane, probably more than the Spitfire. But the fact of the matter is simply this: the Battle of Britain could not have been won without the Hurricane. Had we not had the Spitfire, I hope we could not have won it on its own. It's as simple as that. The Spitfire became the legend. It captured people's imagination with its beautiful design and incredible performance. But the victory belonged to both aircraft and to the men who flew them, despite their flaws. So here's the truth about the Spitfire. It wasn't perfect. It had a fatal flaw that got pilots killed. It had fabric-covered ailerons that failed at high speeds. It was difficult to manufacture, expensive to produce, and couldn't dive properly for the first year of combat. And yet, it became a legend. Why? Because the men who flew it refused to let its flaws define it. They adapted. They innovated. They invented new combat tactics in the middle of battle because they had no other choice. Reginald Mitchell, the Spitfire's designer, died of cancer in 1937. He never saw the Battle of Britain. He never knew about the carburetor problem that plagued his masterpiece. But he did understand something fundamental about design. He used to say, if it looks good, it is good. The Spitfire looked perfect. It became the symbol of British resistance. People on the ground would see those distinctive elliptical wings circling high above them in the summer sky, and they knew their defenders were up there fighting. But the reality was messier than the legend. The reality was young men strapping themselves into aircraft with known flaws, taking off to face an enemy that outnumbered them, and somehow finding ways to win anyway. The carburetor problem was eventually solved. Later, Marks of the Spitfire, the Mark V, the Mark IX, the Mark XIV, became even more formidable. By the end of the war, the Spitfire was faster, heavier, and more powerful than Mitchell could have imagined. It remained in RAF service until 1954, long after the war ended. Over 20,000 Spitfires were built. They flew in every theater of war. But it was in those desperate months of 1940, with Britain standing alone against Nazi Germany, that the Spitfire truly mattered. And in those months, it was deeply, fatally flawed. The lesson isn't that perfection wins wars. The lesson is that adaptability, courage, and determination can overcome even fundamental flaws. Hitler expected the Spitfire's weaknesses to hand him victory. He expected British pilots to give up when they realized their perfect aircraft wasn't so perfect after all. He was wrong. The Spitfire's fatal flaw nearly handed Hitler victory. But in the end, it was British ingenuity, pilot skill, and sheer bloody-mindedness that turned a flawed aircraft into a legendary one. Sometimes, that's all it takes to change history. The Battle of Britain was won by the narrowest of margins. If the carburetor problem had gone unsolved for just a few more weeks, if pilots hadn't figured out the half-roll dive technique, if Spitfire production hadn't ramped up in time, the entire course of World War II could have been different. The Spitfire saved Britain not because it was perfect, but because the people who flew it and built it refused to let its imperfections define it. If you want to learn more about the other legendary British aircraft that changed the war, make sure to check out my video on the Lancaster bomber. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the messy truth behind the legends, hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't about perfect heroes and flawless machines. It's about real people solving real problems under impossible pressure, and sometimes that's even more impressive. All right, friends, we're going to wrap it up right there. If you got any questions or there's a particular aircraft you'd like me to cover, drop a comment down below. I read every single one of them. Don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll catch you in the next video. Y'all be safe out there.